"You'll regret leaving me, Evelyn," Daniel said, loud enough for every glass in the room to pause midair, and the laughter that followed wasn't loud but sharp, the kind that lingers longer than it should under warm chandelier light, his hand resting confidently on the waist of a woman who wore her smile like a trophy, while Evelyn stood at the edge of the marble floor in a black dress that didn't ask for attention and didn't need it, her fingers loosely holding a champagne flute she hadn't tasted, her expression unreadable, almost distant, as if the scene unfolding in front of her had already happened before, as if she had already seen the ending. Daniel took a slow step closer, lowering his voice just enough to feel personal but still audible. "You walked away from everything from me, from this." He gestured casually to the room, the investors, the soft jazz band playing near the balcony, the skyline stretching beyond the glass walls like something he believed he owned. "And now you come back to watch what you lost." A few people nearby exchanged looks, some curious, others quietly entertained, no one interrupting, no one defending, because this was a stage and she was supposed to be the mistake. Evelyn finally lifted her gaze to meet his, calm, steady, not a flicker of anger, not a trace of regret, just a stillness that didn't belong in a room built on noise. Her grip on the glass tightened ever so slightly, the only sign she was even present. Daniel smirked, mistaking silence for defeat, like he always had, like he needed to, because in his version of the story, she had left with nothing, no leverage, no future, just a woman who couldn't keep up. But Evelyn's eyes moved past him for a brief second, scanning the room, the exits, the stage, the quiet cluster of executives near the front, as if checking something off a list only she could see, then back to him, composed, unshaken, as though his words had missed their target entirely. Somewhere across the room, a man in a dark suit stood watching without stepping in, his presence subtle but grounded, not part of the performance, not part of the audience either, just observing. And when the host's voice suddenly cut through the air, announcing an upcoming introduction that would change the future of the company, the energy shifted almost imperceptibly. Daniel barely noticed, still caught in the satisfaction of his own narrative. But Evelyn did, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even, the faintest hint of something unreadable passing through her eyes. Not pride, not relief, something quieter, something already decided. And as the lights dimmed slightly toward the stage, she set her untouched glass down on a passing tray with careful precision, like placing the final piece of something invisible, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. Not for him, not for them, but for what was about to unfold. The music softened as the lights angled toward the stage, but Evelyn's mind had already slipped somewhere far from the polished marble and rehearsed laughter, back to a smaller room that smelled faintly of printer ink and burnt coffee, where the first version of Daniel's company had lived on a folding table barely 3 feet wide, where she had spent nights mapping out growth strategies on a laptop that overheated every hour, her fingers moving faster than the clock on the wall, while Daniel paced behind her talking about vision, about ambition, about how one day they would stand exactly where he stood tonight. Except back then his voice carried excitement instead of entitlement, and when the first investor said no, it was her who rewrote the pitch at 2 a.m. When the second walked out halfway through, it was her who called him back and closed the deal. Every contract, every expansion plan, every calculated risk had passed through her hands first, but her name had never been on the front page, never the one announced, always just behind the glass door, watching him take the stage, and she had accepted it because she believed in building something together, believed in him, until belief started to feel like erasure, until meetings happened without her, until decisions were made that she only heard about after they succeeded, and then came the quiet shift, the new assistant who stayed a little too late. The sudden insistence that Evelyn take some time off, as if the company had outgrown the person who built its spine. She remembered the exact moment it fractured, standing in their kitchen under a white light that made everything look colder than it was, her hand resting on the counter as she read the messages on his phone. Not just words but patterns, weeks of distance explained in a single breath. She did not cry. Not then. She only looked at him when he walked in, waiting for something. That never came. Not regret, not even denial, just a shrug wrapped in impatience. "You are overthinking this," he had said, loosening his tie like the conversation was an inconvenience, and when she asked him if any of it had ever been real, he did not answer right away. He poured himself a drink, took a sip, and then with a calm that felt sharper than anger, said, "You are part of the process, Evelyn, but you are not the future." And something inside her did not break. It recalibrated. Because in that moment she understood that everything she had built had been handed over without protection, without ownership, without even acknowledgement, and that leaving would not be the loss he thought it would be the first move. So she packed one suitcase, exactly one, measured, deliberate, not rushed, not emotional, just precise, and when she walked out, the city air felt different, like stepping into a version of her life that had been waiting quietly for permission. She did not look back because there was nothing behind her that still belonged to her, only things she had not yet taken back, and now, standing again in the glow of the same world that once excluded her, Evelyn's gaze remained steady, not on Daniel, not on the crowd, but somewhere ahead, as if she was already watching the next scene unfold before anyone else even realized the script had changed. The applause began to rise as the host stepped fully into the spotlight, but Evelyn did not join in, her gaze steady, her posture unchanged, as if she were slightly out of sync with the room, like someone who already knew how the scene would end and had no need to react to its beginning. Daniel turned briefly toward the stage, distracted by the shift in attention, his confidence intact, his smile returning as he adjusted his cufflinks, unaware that for the first time that night he was no longer the center of gravity. Evelyn's eyes moved again, not hurried, not nervous, simply precise, landing momentarily on the cluster of executives near the front row, then toward the man she had noticed earlier, still standing at a distance, still saying nothing, yet his presence carried a quiet authority that did not need introduction. Their eyes met for less than a second, no nod, no signal, just recognition, like two people acknowledging a shared understanding without exposing it, and then he looked away first, deliberately, as if giving her the stage she had once been denied. Daniel leaned slightly closer again, lowering his voice with a trace of impatience. "You always did this, pretending you are above it, but you are not, Evelyn. You walked away, remember that." His words were softer now, less for the crowd and more for himself, as if repeating something he needed to believe. Evelyn listened, her expression unchanged, but her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of her dress, grounding, controlled, every movement measured. She was not absorbing his words, she was waiting, because timing had always been the difference between reaction and strategy. The host's voice grew clearer, introducing the concept of growth, expansion, the future of the company, phrases Daniel had used countless times before, but tonight they sounded different, heavier, like they belonged to someone else now. A subtle shift passed through the room as a few executives exchanged glances, something unspoken but felt, like the air just before a storm that no one can yet see. Daniel noticed it too, just for a second, his brow tightening almost imperceptibly before he dismissed it. Turning back to Evelyn with a half-smile that no longer felt as steady. "You should have stayed," he added, quieter now and for the first time it sounded less like a threat and more like a question that arrived too late. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, not in confusion but in quiet acknowledgement, as if she had already considered that version of reality and chosen against it long ago. Her eyes did not soften. They clarified, reflecting not the past he was holding onto but the outcome he had failed to anticipate. On the stage, the host paused deliberately, creating a silence that stretched just long enough to pull every eye forward, every conversation dissolving into anticipation, and in that suspended moment, Evelyn took a single step forward, not toward Daniel, not toward the crowd, but toward something only she seemed to see clearly, her presence shifting from background to focus without effort, without announcement. Daniel straightened instinctively, sensing the change without understanding it, his confidence flickering for the briefest second, as if something beneath the surface had moved out of place, and as the host finally began to introduce the name that would redefine everything, Evelyn's expression remained calm, almost distant, because for her, this was not the reveal, it was simply the confirmation of A decision that had been made long before anyone in that room realized they were already part of it. The name echoed across the room, steady and deliberate, carried through the speakers with a clarity that cut through every remaining whisper. But before the audience could fully react, Evelyn's mind moved elsewhere again, not to the past that hurt, but to the version of herself that had learned to rebuild without noise. Mornings that began before sunrise in a small apartment that overlooked nothing remarkable, where the light came in soft and unannounced, where she sat at a narrow desk with a laptop and pages of financial reports spread out in careful order, teaching herself what no one had ever bothered to teach her before, not just how to build something, but how to own it, how to protect it, how to move through systems that had once excluded her without ever asking for permission again. There were no dramatic turning points, no sudden rescues, just discipline, repetition, decisions made quietly and consistently, days measured not in recognition but in progress. She learned how acquisitions worked, how companies expanded too quickly, how founders like Daniel often traded control for speed without realizing what they were giving away. And when the first opportunity appeared, it did not look like revenge. It looked like numbers on a page, a company restructuring, shares being offered through channels most people ignored. Evelyn did not hesitate, not emotionally, only analytically. She built a network slowly, carefully, never attaching her name, never stepping into visibility. Each move small enough to avoid attention, but precise enough to build momentum, and somewhere along that path she met Alexander Hayes. Not in a moment of rescue, but in a room where decisions were made without introductions, where he noticed something in the way she asked questions, not to impress but to understand leverage. He did not ask about her past, and she did not offer it because it was no longer relevant to the direction she was moving. What mattered was alignment. And, in him, she found someone who recognized strategy without needing explanation. Their conversations were efficient, focused, never personal, built on mutual respect rather than assumption, and when he introduced her to larger opportunities, it was not as a favor, it was as recognition of capability. Together they moved through acquisitions that others overlooked, building a structure that did not announce itself, that did not need validation, and over time, without a single public moment, without a single headline, pieces began to connect, investments layered into influence, influence into control, until the company Daniel believed he still commanded had already begun to shift beneath him, not through confrontation, but through decisions he signed himself, deals he celebrated, expansions he believed were his own victories, never realizing who stood on the other side of those agreements. And now, back in the present, as the room held its breath between announcement and understanding, Evelyn stood exactly where she had chosen to stand, not by chance, not by return, but by design. Her expression unchanged, her presence steady, because everything that was about to be revealed was not a surprise to her. It was simply the moment the world would finally catch up to what she had already become. The silence stretched just a fraction longer than expected, the kind that makes people shift their weight without realizing it. And then the host continued, voice steady but now carrying a different weight, speaking about vision, about transformation, about a new phase that would redefine leadership. Daniel's attention snapped fully to the stage, his earlier confidence returning in a controlled breath as he straightened his posture, already preparing to receive recognition that he believed was his. While beside him Evelyn remained still, her gaze fixed forward, not searching, not anticipating, simply aligned with what was already in motion. The name introduced next was not unfamiliar to the room, Alexander Hayes, spoken with respect, with quiet authority, a figure known for precision rather than spectacle, and as he stepped into the light there was no dramatic pause in his movement, no attempt to command attention. Yet the room adjusted around him, conversations dissolving, attention narrowing, because power that does not announce itself often carries the most weight. Daniel's expression shifted subtly, not concern, not yet, but curiosity, calculating, trying to understand why this presence felt less like partnership and more like transition. Alexander's voice was calm when he began, measured, each word placed without excess, speaking not about potential but about completion, about decisions already finalized, about structures already in place, and somewhere within those words, the tone of the room changed again, quieter now, more focused. as if something beneath the surface had just been acknowledged without being fully explained. Evelyn took another small step forward, aligning herself closer to the center without drawing attention to the movement, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, while Daniel's eyes flickered briefly toward her, something unreadable passing through his gaze before he dismissed it, still anchored to the belief that whatever was happening remained within his control. Alexander paused for a brief moment, not for effect but for clarity, allowing the silence to settle before continuing, and when he spoke again, the words were precise. "The acquisition process has been completed over the past several months." The sentence landed softly, but carried a weight that shifted the room entirely. A few executives exchanged glances, subtle but immediate, as if pieces that had not made sense before were suddenly aligning. Daniel's jaw tightened just slightly, his focus sharpening, recalculating, because this was not part of the narrative he had prepared for, not the kind of announcement that positioned him at the center, and yet he remained still, composed, because years of control had taught him how to maintain appearance even when certainty began to fracture. Evelyn did not react outwardly, but there was a quiet stillness in her that felt final, not tense, not anticipatory, simply resolved, as if every step leading to this moment had already been completed long before she entered the room. And as Alexander's gaze moved briefly across the audience before settling forward again, the space between what people believed and what was about to be revealed narrowed to almost nothing, the kind of moment where everything appears unchanged on the surface, yet underneath, the foundation has already shifted, and Daniel, standing exactly where he had always stood, had not yet realized that the ground beneath him no longer belonged to him. The room felt different now, not louder, not quieter, but tighter, as if every person inside had unconsciously leaned into the same moment, trying to understand something that had not been fully said yet, and Alexander did not rush to fill that silence. He let it exist, controlled, deliberate, the kind of pause that separates assumption from reality. Daniel's posture remained upright, but there was a subtle rigidity in the way his shoulders held, a calculation happening behind his eyes, quick, instinctive, searching for variables he might have missed, while beside him Evelyn stood unchanged, her presence steady, almost detached from the tension building around her, as if she were not inside the moment, but slightly ahead of it. Alexander continued, his voice even. "Over the past year, strategic shares were acquired through a series of independent transactions." The phrasing was precise, intentionally neutral, but its implications spread through the room like a quiet ripple. A few executives shifted, recognition beginning to form in fragments, not yet complete, but enough to unsettle certainty. Daniel's gaze sharpened, his attention no longer divided, fully locked on the stage now, his mind tracing back through every deal, every expansion, every agreement he had signed with confidence, each one justified at the time, each one part of growth, of scaling, of winning, and yet now those same decisions began to rearrange themselves into something less stable, something he had not fully controlled. Evelyn's eyes lowered briefly, not in hesitation, but in acknowledgement, as if she could see those same moments replaying from a different angle, each signature, each negotiation, each percentage exchanged, not as loss, but as placement, the careful redistribution of power that had never needed to announce itself. Alexander took another measured breath before continuing. "Those transactions now represent a controlling interest." The sentence landed cleanly, without emphasis, without drama, and yet it shifted everything. The word controlling did not echo, but it settled, heavy and undeniable, the kind of word that does not require repetition. Daniel's jaw tightened again, this time not hidden, his confidence no longer automatic. Because control was not a concept he associated with anyone but himself, and yet the structure being described no longer included him. At the center, a quiet murmur moved through the edges of the room, subtle but present, not confusion, but realization forming collectively, and still, Evelyn did not react, not outwardly, her breathing steady, her posture unchanged, because for her, this was not new information. It was simply the moment where what had been built in silence became visible to others. Daniel turned his head slightly toward her, slower this time, his expression searching, Not accusing, not yet, but questioning in a way he had never needed to before, as if something about her stillness no longer fit the role he had assigned to her, and for the first time, there was a crack in the certainty he had carried all night. A hesitation that had nothing to do with the room and everything to do with what he was beginning to understand. Alexander's gaze moved once more across the audience, then settled forward again, the final pieces of the announcement clearly aligned, and as the space between realization and confirmation narrowed to a single breath, Evelyn lifted her eyes again, calm, precise, already standing exactly where the outcome required her to be. Daniel's breath slowed, not from calm, but from control, the kind he had trained himself to maintain in boardrooms and negotiations. But this was different. This was not a deal he could redirect with a sentence or a signature. His eyes remained fixed on Alexander, yet his awareness had shifted entirely, recalculating everything that had led to this moment. Every expansion he had celebrated, every percentage he had willingly released in exchange for speed, for scale, for the illusion of dominance. And now those decisions no longer aligned in his favor. They formed a pattern he had not seen until it was already complete. Beside him, the woman on his arm shifted slightly, her confidence faltering just enough to be felt, though she said nothing, because the room itself had changed, the subtle hierarchy rearranging in real time, attention no longer orbiting Daniel but pulling toward the stage, toward the source of the shift, toward the quiet center that had not yet been fully revealed. Evelyn remained still, her posture unchanged, her gaze steady, not avoiding him, not confronting him, simply existing outside the version of her he still expected to see, and that absence of reaction unsettled him more than any confrontation could have, because it removed the structure he understood. He turned his head toward her again, slower now, his voice lower, no longer performing for anyone else. "What did you do?" The question was not sharp, not aggressive, it was controlled. But beneath it was something unfamiliar, not anger, not yet, but the beginning of recognition. Evelyn met his gaze without hesitation, her eyes clear, unburdened by the past he was still holding on to, and for a brief moment, there was silence between them that felt separate from the room, as if everything else had paused just outside that space. She did not answer immediately because she did not need to. The answer was already unfolding around him, already embedded in the structure he was only beginning to see. On stage, Alexander continued, outlining the transition with precision, not dramatic, not personal, just factual, which made it harder to resist, harder to deny, the kind of truth that does not argue. It simply exists. Daniel's jaw tightened again, but this time it was not hidden, the control he relied on thinning slightly at the edges, his mind moving faster now, tracing connections, questioning timelines, replaying conversations that once felt insignificant, trying to locate the exact moment. Control had shifted away from him, but there was no single moment. That was the design. It had never been taken, it had been transferred, piece by piece, decision by decision, until there was nothing left to reclaim. Evelyn finally spoke, her voice quiet, even, carrying no edge, no satisfaction, just clarity. "Nothing you did not agree to." The words settled between them without force, but they landed deeper than anything louder could have, because they did not accuse, they revealed. Daniel held her gaze for a second longer, searching for something, denial, hesitation, anything that would restore the version of reality he had been operating within, but there was none. Only certainty, calm and unshaken. And as the room continued to shift around them, as attention moved fully toward the stage where the final confirmation was about to be spoken, Daniel understood, not all at once, but enough to feel the ground change beneath him, enough to realize that this was not a moment he could step out of. And Evelyn, standing just inches away, had not returned to his world. She had quietly rebuilt it until it belonged to her. The final words settled into the room with a precision that left no space for interpretation. Alexander's voice calm, unwavering, the controlling shareholder of the company, effective immediately. He paused just long enough for the weight of the statement to anchor itself, not for drama but for clarity, and then his gaze shifted, not across the crowd, but directly toward Evelyn. "Is Ms. Evelyn Carter?" There was no immediate reaction, not at first, just a stillness that spread faster than sound, like the room itself needed a second to catch up to what had already been decided. And then it came, subtle at first, a ripple of movement, heads turning, expressions changing, recognition forming where doubt had been. Daniel did not move, not because he chose not to, but because for a moment movement did not make sense. His mind stalled between disbelief and realization, searching for an angle that no longer existed. Beside him the space felt different, not physically, but in presence. Evelyn was no longer standing within his orbit. She had become the center of a different gravity entirely. She stepped forward, one measured step, not hurried, not hesitant, simply aligned with the direction everything had already been moving. The sound of her heels against the floor was soft, controlled, yet it carried through the silence with a clarity that drew every eye. Alexander extended his hand, not as introduction, but as acknowledgement, and she accepted it with the same calm precision that had defined every move she had made. There were no grand gestures, no display, just a quiet confirmation of what had already been built. The distance between where she had once stood and where she stood now was not marked by time, but by intention. Daniel's gaze followed her, slower now, heavier, as if each second added weight to what he was beginning to understand, not just that he had lost control, but how completely it had happened without his awareness. Every deal he had signed, every share he had released, every decision he had justified as growth had led here, not by chance but by design. And the realization did not arrive as shock. It arrived as clarity, sharp and irreversible. Evelyn did not look at him as she moved, not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left in that direction that required her attention. The room began to shift around her, people adjusting, recalibrating, their expressions no longer casual, no longer dismissive, but attentive, respectful. The same room that had once seen her as an absence now recognized her as authority, and yet she did not absorb it, did not react to it, because this moment was not validation, it was confirmation, a visible outcome of something that had been completed long before. Alexander released her hand as she reached the front, stepping slightly aside, not stepping back, but allowing space without diminishing presence. A subtle shift that spoke of alignment rather than hierarchy. Evelyn faced the room, her posture steady, her expression composed, and for a brief moment, everything settled. The noise, the movement, the assumptions, all of it quieted into a single point of understanding, and somewhere behind her, Daniel remained where he was, unchanged in position, yet entirely displaced in reality, watching not the loss of a company, but the realization that the future he had built no longer included him at its center, and Evelyn, standing in the light he once claimed, did not claim it at all. She simply occupied it, as if it had always been hers. The applause came slowly, not explosive, not overwhelming, but measured, controlled, the kind of applause that signals recognition rather than celebration, and Evelyn stood within it without absorbing any of it, her expression unchanged, her posture steady, as if the sound existed somewhere outside of her, as if this moment was not something to react to but something to move through. She turned slightly, not toward the center of the stage, but toward the exit, a subtle shift that most people would not notice, but those who did understood immediately. This was not her destination. It was simply a point along the way. Alexander watched her for a brief second, not stopping her, not following, just acknowledging the movement with the faintest nod, because he understood what the room was only beginning to learn, that her power did not come from standing in the spotlight, it came from knowing when to leave it. Daniel remained where he was, his hands no longer relaxed at his sides, his posture still upright but no longer effortless, his gaze fixed on her as she stepped down from the stage, each step quiet, controlled, unaffected by the weight of the room behind her, and for the first time, he did not call out to her, did not attempt to reclaim the moment with words, because there was nothing left to claim, only something to understand, and understanding arrived slowly, heavier than denial. He replayed everything, not just the deals, not just the signatures, but the conversations, the dismissals, the moments he had overlooked because they did not seem important at the time. And now those same moments formed a pattern he could no longer ignore. Evelyn reached the edge of the room, the light softer there, the noise fading slightly as distance replaced attention, and she paused for just a second, not out of hesitation, but out of completion, as if marking the end of something that no longer needed to follow her forward. She did not turn back immediately, but when she did, it was not to look at Daniel. Not directly. Her gaze passed over him, through him, acknowledging his presence without anchoring to it, and in that brief glance there was no anger, no satisfaction, no trace of the past he still carried, only distance, clear and absolute, the kind that cannot be closed by apology or regret. Daniel held that moment longer than it lasted, because it was the first time he saw her without the version of her he had created, and the realization settled deeper than anything spoken. She had not left and failed. She had left and built something beyond his reach, something that did not need him, did not revolve around him, and never would again. Evelyn turned back toward the exit, her steps continuing, unhurried, precise, the sound of the room fading behind her as the doors opened and the night air met her with a quiet stillness that felt more real than anything inside. She stepped out without looking back, not because she was trying to prove something, but because there was nothing left behind that belonged to her, and as the doors closed softly, separating two entirely different worlds, the only thing that remained was the quiet truth that did not need to be spoken. She did not win him back. She won her.